So that's fantastic. So, Lydia is going to speak to us today about feminism. And honestly, this is a topic that sometimes kind of makes me a little nervous because of my own personal shortcomings. I was raised here. And when you're white and you're raised in Texas, you learn as you're growing up a way to speak about things, with the ways of talking about race, ways of talking about women. And I'm ashamed to say I was probably 30 before I realized how much was packed into describing a black man as articulate. And those are important things for us to try to learn, and opportunities for personal growth. And that's kind of what I hope we're going to get out of this today, because I was probably in my upper 40s and probably still fall short in terms of some of the things that I say, the jokes that I think might be funny in regards to feminism. And so I appreciate Lydia coming up and speaking to this about today. And everybody take it in the spirit that it's intended, and find opportunities to grow in terms of how you speak about women's rights, and how you approach the issue of misogyny and whatnot. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Miss Lydia Allan.
Sorry, guys. Okay. Uh-oh. And the stand is not working, sorry.
Just want to take it out?
Well, I need it because I need to look at my notes on my phone. Yeah, that works. Okay. No, well, as long as everybody can hear me. Here we go. Let's turn it this way. Can y'all hear me? There we go. Okay. I want to make sure I can speak into the microphone because I think it affects the video footage. But thank you for that introduction, Al. And yes, I titled the name of the talk Mythbusters because I wanted it to be a little more lighthearted. I do think that racism and feminism are things that can be really sensitive topics. And so I'm not really here to lecture or to upset anyone today. But I do want to talk about a few of the ways that we kind of get feminism wrong sometimes. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is how a lot of folks seem to think that feminism is monolithic, and in its monolith that it's quite radical. And I'm here to tell you today that this is a myth that we're going to bust. So one thing that I want to make you aware of is that feminism has actually been around for several hundred years and has occurred in what scholars frequently refer to as waves. So the early feminists were, if we talk about the first wave feminists, were concerned with women's suffrage. They wanted to make sure that women had the right to vote. Occasionally they talked about education for women as well. And so that would be sort of our first wave feminists. Now, one of the drawbacks of early feminism is that many of the feminists were, in fact, white women who may have had their own ideas about people of other races and how society should be arranged hierarchically according to that. And so feminism developed into, later on, something more that was more ambitious, and that was what we would commonly described as the second wave feminism. Its heyday was kind of the 60s, 70s, 80s, right around there. But again, discussions on what affluent white women should be doing and how we can break into places that are inhabited by men frequently leaves out non-affluent folks. It leaves out people of color frequently. And so that is one of the shortcomings of second wave feminism. And so we are now kind of in what we call the third wave of feminism. And there's a lot of misunderstandings about third wave feminism. You'll see folks online say, man, those third wave feminists are so radical. But I really don't think there's much radical about the idea that everybody has dignity, and it really doesn't matter if you're a person of color or, if you're transgender. All of us are included. Feminism has broadened its scope, and the other thing is that is as unifying as it seems that we are in quote unquote the third wave, that doesn't change the fact that there are many different approaches to feminism. There are indeed radical feminists, that's true. There are a number of other kinds of feminists as well. There are pragmatic feminists. There are humanist feminists. There are, among the scholarly discussions of feminism, we have feminist epistemology. We have feminist philosophy of science. We have a number of ways of thinking about feminism. Some feminists are sex positive, some feminists are sex negative because they see ways that women are treated in the exchange of sex in negative ways. And so in that sense, there is not one monolithic idea about feminism. And when we hear people online say things like feminism is bad, feminism is wrong, feminists hate men, they're radical, none of that is correct. Okay, so another thing about feminism is that beyond being in particular many scholarly fields of feminism, we do in fact have political feminism as well. We might think of someone like Hillary Clinton as a political feminist, or any number of women working in the field of political influence in that circle. So feminism has many different places where it affects people. We don't just, sorry y'all, my phone is distracting me because it keeps asking me to set up Android Pay. Sorry. That's why I'm like, what? I'm trying to talk here, y'all. Okay, so no to Android Pay, thank you. Okay, so as I was saying, feminism is not just scholarly, it is also political. And so in the sense that you will have folks on especially websites, Facebook and whatnot, stating political opinions about what it is women should be able to do and how we should be able to interact. One thing about political feminism is that we have things like the women that marched on Washington, was it a year ago? And there's a couple of things that came out of that political march that were interesting and somewhat problematic. One of the things was whether or not women should include women who are pro-life. Should we include those women and count them as feminists? There are a number of pro-life women who consider themselves feminists. Now, there's a difference between being pro-life and anti-choice. And I would argue that you can, in fact, be pro-life and be a feminist. It's my personal opinion that you cannot be a feminist and be anti-choice, because now you're taking away the choices that women get to make about their own healthcare situations. Other things, can you wear a hijab and be a feminist? I think the answer to that is actually decidedly yes, because again, we're actually talking about whether or not women have a choice, right? And I've heard a number of folks online say things like, it's the regressive left that thinks it's okay to defend hijab wearing women. I'm like, actually, no, I'm not regressive in any way, shape, or form. If a woman chooses to put a hijab on because she wants to participate in her culture, that is her business, not mine. And I may argue against people who force women into such situations, but that's a whole nother kettle of fish. So that kind of stuff arises out of these political discussions of feminism. Feminism, what I would say, the number one sort of broad, most broad definition of feminism I can come up with without making it a monolithic, is that it is about women, trans, femme, any number of folks that identify on that range of feminine, having choices that they can make in their own lives. And how we negotiate that and how all of that works is nothing, there's nothing monolithic about it. All right, so that's myth number one. Busted. All right, myth number two. Feminism has turned into misandry. So I'm not a feminist, I'm a humanist. Okay, there's some problems with this myth. One of the problems of this myth is that humanism, unfortunately, humanism has been around for a long time, many hundreds of years. But humanism, unfortunately, has a history of disincluding women, right? And so it's interesting to say, I'm not going to choose to use the label feminist, I'm going to choose to be humanist, because that includes everybody. Well, actually, traditionally, it has not always included everybody. A great example of this is the humanists that founded our country. Well, it says right there in our founding documents that all men are created equal. And then when you ask people what that means, they say, well, that means everybody. Well, it kind of didn't mean everybody. It kind of actually meant land-holding, affluent, white men were all created equal, because that was the practicality of it all. So because humanism does, in fact, have a history of discrimination against both women and people of color, I think it's appropriate to say your brand of humanism is, in fact, feminism, and that feminism is a humanism. It's a contemporary humanism. Another thing is that there is this idea of reverse sexism that is frequently thrown about. Reverse sexism is this idea that we are already all on a level playing field. It's the idea that if we're all on a level playing field and women are getting special treatment, well, that's really unfair. That's reverse sexism. Well, we're not all on a level playing field. If we were already there, we wouldn't have needs for talks like this. And so the accusation that reverse sexism is happening is, I think it belies a failure to think about the fact that not everybody is, there is not a solid equality around women and people of color present. So the things that we do to help to give women a hand up, there's nothing sexist about that because we are not getting the privileges, the special privileges that other folks are getting. My phone is still asking me to set up Android Pay. I don't know what that's all about. Okay. I know. So that brings us to the topic of special privilege. Special privilege is problematic because what special privilege is, oh my gosh, y'all, sorry. Good Lord, I don't know what's going on. Okay, is it airplane mode? Sorry, y'all. I didn't bring my computer up here because I was like, whoa, what if my computer cuts out and it messes with my talk? And so I downloaded my notes to my phone thinking that wouldn't be an issue. Okay, so when we're talking about special privilege, what we're talking about are sort of the quiet, subtle assumptions that happen just about everywhere there's a certain amount of dignity or a certain amount of trust, if you will, that is granted to some folks and not to others. And so, a humanism like feminism is designed to challenge those ideas, right? If you walk into a room and there's 6 people giving a talk, and there's an older white man giving a talk, and there's a younger African-American woman giving a talk, I mean, who do you think gets sort of the automatic kudos, right? Or sort of seems to be the automatically wise person in the room, right? That kind of special privilege is one of the things that feminism is designed to try to get around. Okay, the other thing is that one of the things I've noticed the most about folks who level charges of feminists as being man-haters, misandrists, is that there's a lot of actual anger towards us for having the gumption to actually ask for equality. It is not seen as equality, it's seen as special privilege in a way that we are asking for. And there are folks that are angry about it because they feel that it affects them personally. So, long story short, feminism is not misandry. Feminism is the idea that women are, in fact, equal to men. And I am a feminist because I'm a humanist. Myth busted. All right, moving on. You often hear people say, I'm all for equal rights. So because I'm all for equal rights, I can't possibly oppress women or femmes. And unfortunately, this is not true. You can have the most purest intentions in the world and still, in some ways, affect the lives of people around you in negative ways, whether it's women or people of color. So one of the things I think is probably the biggest misunderstanding that folks have is this idea of systemic oppression. Systemic oppression means that we are all part of a large system of interactions of humans. It might be political, it might be institutional. There's just a number of places where systemic oppressions can happen. And systemic oppressions typically happen when a lot of it is stuff we don't even sort of realize. It's the idea that, for instance, we can't discuss our paychecks at work, right? It's considered rude or problematic to actually discuss what you're making with other people at work. Well, if nobody is willing to tell me what their salaries are at work, how am I supposed to know who's being paid what and whether I'm being paid fairly? And unfortunately, the refusal to discuss salaries at work will, in fact, disadvantage me because I now don't know what other people are making and whether or not I need to go into my boss and have a discussion with him about the fact that I'm being paid 20% less than other people. Microaggressions are another kind of systemic situation that people don't think about in terms of I can't oppress people because I'm all for equal rights. Okay. Microaggressions are well-meaning questions that irritate people over time. And it's really, there are a ton of examples. For example, one microaggression that people who are Asian typically experience is that folks will ask them, "Where are you from?" Right? "Where are you from?" "Well, I was born in Cleveland," right? No, what we really mean is, well, like, where are you from? My great-grandparents were North Korean, right? And this kind of question gets asked over and over again to people, and it becomes annoying to them, because when you've been asked for the 60th time where you're from, you might look at somebody and be like, "I'm from Cleveland," and then they're like, "God, man, what a jerk, I just asked where they're from." Women experience this all the time. It happens to me all the time. On the internet, for instance, people will notice that I get pissed off about something and I'm not very nice about the way that I state it, and suddenly everybody wonders, "God, why is she being such a bitch?" Right? Because I've been asked this question 15,000 times before, and I'm tired of answering it, to be honest, right? That's what microaggressions do. Instead of folks being willing to say, "Gosh, maybe women have sort of slightly different experiences. We inhabit spaces in a world where we see things other people don't see sometimes." Folks instead will contribute to me a personal attribute about my personality based on the fact that I'm annoyed about a situation that I'm having to deal with over and over again repeatedly. All right, so systemic oppression, microaggressions. This brings us to well-meaning acts that burden people. Again, you can. One of the things that, I guess, one of the most aggravating things about being a woman sometimes is that people are well-meaning and they have expectations about what I would want. And they try to treat me that way, and it's very kind, and I appreciate it, and I really like it. But some of the assumptions about what I would want are incorrect. What I do not want, for instance, is to have to always do emotional labor on behalf of other people. Like sometimes people want to give me the opportunity to show that I'm kind and that I'm caring, because I'm a woman, that's what I'm supposed to be, right? And so they will ask me or present me an opportunity to do emotional labor, that's what it is, to help myself or to help someone else. And so these sorts of assumptions, although they're very kind and they're well-meaning, it just adds more work to the pile. So 3 things going on with you can't oppress women or femmes because you didn't mean to. Systemic oppression, microaggressions, well-meaning acts that actually burden people, all stuff to kind of think about. And again, we're going to have a Q&A after all this is over, so I will love your questions on any of this stuff. Number 4, we have only 2 more myths to go. Number 4, women are truly equal now, so we don't need feminism anymore. I kind of hinted at this earlier. No, that is in fact not true. The myth of wage equality is something that frequently gets discussed online. And of course, what always happens in online discussion is people say, prove it, prove it, prove it, prove it, that women are still only making so much compared to men. And one of the most frustrating things about that argument online is that I can in fact present you with credible sources on not just the fact that white women make lower amounts of money than white men, but that women of color make significantly lower amounts. So even if you want to argue with me that the wage gap between white women and white men has closed, you can't possibly argue with me that that's true for, say, African American or Hispanic women and white men. And yet that the resistance to that discussion persists. I think one thing that's really hard to argue is the fact that there is a lack of women in powerful positions, period, end of story. There is no argument to be made that we are now in 2017 and still do not have a female president. We still have something like 20% of our entire legislative body. It persists of women. There's something like, I want to say, 12 to 15% of women as CEOs anywhere. If you look at a university, the number of white men who are conducting classes far outweighs the number of women and people of color. So that right there it's not even an argument. One thing that these arguments frequently rely on is the fallacy of relative privation, and this is where Sometimes folks in the skeptic movement mean well, and yet they burden us women anyway. Oh, well, you're not a Muslim woman wearing a hijab living in a country where they practice genital mutilation, so what problems do you have? That is a fallacy of relative privation. The fact that there is not widespread equality means that just because someone else's equality situation is far worse than mine doesn't mean that I don't have problems that I'm also dealing with. Sexual violence, incredibly common, incredibly common. I myself have been a victim of sexual violence multiple times. I would dare say every woman in this room has at least at one point had someone's hand on her body that she didn't want there, at least at one point. Another place where we women often experience inequality is in our intimate relationships. There is often ideas about how men and women should interact, about gender roles, what it means to be a wife, what it means to be a mother. Frequently promote various inequalities, intimate relationships about how women love, how we have sex. All of those things frequently promote put us in positions where we cannot fight or cannot stand up for ourselves without causing lots of problems with our partner. The other thing is the erasure of making or the making of less visible of women's life narratives. So we get lots and lots of stories in popular culture and various places about women's narratives that are usually centered around romance. For instance, now it has changed somewhat recently that we are just now getting women in action films and so on and so forth. But the erasure of our narratives as people who go out into the world and have sort of this Odyssean, interaction with the world where we travel around and we understand and come to gain wisdom. That narrative is so powerful. Odysseus's wife had her own Odyssey in that poem. Of course, it's several thousand years old, but her entire Odyssey happens in her house. Like, she never leaves her house, right? And this erasure of women's life narratives is very, very common. Final point. Feminists don't care about injustices towards men. This is probably the one that I find to be the most frustrating because frequently this charge is meant to diminish any argument that I could make about what is happening, wrongs on the ground. There's always a whataboutism to this. Well, what about, they insert problematic situation here, which in the context of a conversation is a red herring fallacy, because just because I'm not talking right then about the injustices that men experience doesn't mean that I don't care about them. One of the things that gets passed over frequently and that I do care a great deal about is that men do in fact experience sexual and domestic violence. So while the numbers I believe are 1 in 5 women, the numbers are something like 1 in 18 men experience these sorts of violence. Those numbers add up quickly. I mean, there's over 300 million people in this country, which means that translates to millions of men. So we do in fact care a great deal about that. The other whataboutism point that always seems to get inserted into a discussion of feminism: what about the courts? What about the fact that men have to pay child support? And that to me is an entirely separate issue that deserves discussion, but I think it also needs to be contextualized within the idea that in fact women do make 20% less, and sometimes more than that, than their male counterparts. We frequently, if we're women of color, make 40% less. And so this idea that it's so inherently unfair for a man to pay child support, I'm like, well, I would argue that may be the case, but when we're looking at the numbers as a whole, the fact is that in some ways child support acts as a pay equalizer, especially when you consider the fact that women are the ones who are most frequently situated with the kids and have to be there daily and spend money, their own money on all of that. So all of those myths about feminism, I just kind of wanted to throw out in the audience. I hope it will stir discussion, because at this point, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to start listening to what you guys have to say. I'm going to take some questions to see if we can have some productive conversation. Yes, hey, Janie.
I loved that. Thank you. This isn't really necessarily a question. It's just a situation I'm experiencing.
Sure.
And I'm having like a what would Lydia Allan do kind of moment.
Thank you.
Work in a hospital setting, a lot of people, elderly with traumatic brain injury, strokes, dementia. And a lot of times when you're sick and in that position, you revert to your base level, which means I get touched very frequently in ways I don't want to be. So my butt's grabbed all the time. I have had my shirt pulled down. And I found out this week that someone that I treated for several weeks is now home, and the therapist that works with him at home, he has many pictures of me on his phone and the other therapists that he took without our knowledge. So what do you do when you have an obligation to provide care for someone that's sick?
Yeah, so let's think on this for a second, because you're right. They are in a vulnerable position and are in need of care. You are a care provider, but your dignity should not be affronted in that way, frankly. So,
This happens to nurses, and like you can read on Reddit nurses' experiences.
yeah, not surprising. Yeah, not surprising. So, one of the potential solutions that somebody might throw out would be, well, you can refuse care to that patient or shift the patient load to another nurse, right? Except that that's right. What's the likely gender of the other nurse going to be? It's likely going to be another woman.
We have like 2 male caregivers on different shifts, that's it.
Yeah, yeah. So the question is, what do we do? I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to think on it very carefully about that. But I'm curious to know if there is a process available to you at your workplace where you can document these situations. And if so, what do the higher ups at your job do about it, or do they do anything about it?
Well, they're men.
Yeah.
So what I worry is if I do it too, I mean, the fear is that if you do it too often,
Yeah.
it's going to be as if I don't want to provide care.
Yes.
So it's just
Okay, so there's the
issue.
choice, right? There's the choice. The choice is we can provide care to people who we genuinely care about and have our butts grabbed. Great. Or we can go to management and say, gosh, I keep getting my butt grabbed. And they'll go, you don't sound like you really care about these patients.
Yep.
That's a perverse choice. And that is a reality that, unless somebody is willing to talk about it, unless that narrative is, put out there, that people are not going to know that that's problematic for you. Yes, Megan.
There is a grassroots movement right now going on for healthcare workers because it is such a problem and it's a systemic issue.
Yeah.
It's not even just for women, but I mean, obviously we're affected more. So there is, I'll tell you about it after the session, but there's a huge group that has identified this as a major issue in healthcare and it needs to change.
Yeah.
Inequality I see too is if a male respiratory therapist is threatened to be punched.
Yeah.
Will be spoke to by administration that they can no longer do that or they will be transferred from the facility.
So one of the things that I was a special ed teacher for several years, and I worked with kids who were severely impacted by their cognitive disabilities. And although I never received any sort of sexual harassment because I worked at the elementary level, I did receive physical threats pretty regularly from some of my bigger kids. And so we had protocols in place to deal with that. And what we had was called a least restrictive environment. And we would put kids in restraints if we had to, because the fact of the matter is that I cannot have a 75 to 80 pound kid running at me full steam and knocking me to the ground. So the question then becomes, is there a way to, in fact, restrain patients who can't keep their hands to themselves? Is that something that's possible, that when I enter the room, I'm going to put your hands in restraints because I don't want your hands to end up on the backside of my body? Is that something that's available to you guys as healthcare providers? Yeah.
It really does come down to administration and whether or not they are receptive to implementing these things to protect their workers.
Okay.
To be perfectly honest, it depends on how much I want to put up with because that involves a lot of paperwork.
Yeah.
So if I do that, I protect hands from being on my body, but I take 45 minutes for my kids that evening.
Yeah, no, I hear exactly what you're saying, because we had the same thing in education.
I also have to shower men.
Yeah.
So what I do now is I just go like a child route. I will grab their wrist, put it in their lap, and just say no.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I was seen doing that, if that would be considered that I'm too harsh.
Yeah. So I think another systemic issue that arises here is the fact that you don't have someone with you while that's going on. I don't think you should be alone.
We do for each other.
Yeah.
When we know that's what we will do.
Okay.
Sometimes everything is a trade-off. You're asking another worker to have a longer day, but we do it. It's what we have to do.
Everything is a trade-off. Exactly right. That is exactly the situation. Yes. Who's next?
Well, I was just curious, can't they make sure that there's no phones? That seems like a simple thing,
Yeah,
you know?
just found that out. I don't know. I have female patients who keep their phones because they have children at home.
Yeah.
I don't want to say nobody can have a phone in my therapy room.
Yeah.
I'd rather not, but I don't know. Yeah.
You want to speak to that? Oh, no. Okay. Can you speak a little more to the emotional labor that women are often subjected to?
Yes. So, okay, guys, when your best friend comes to you with a problem, right? And you sit down with him and you guys talk about it, and you may show a little empathy, but at some point the discussion ends, right? Not a whole lot of emotion is exchanged. I mean, if it's a really huge problem like their parent is dying, maybe. But what essentially I think happens, and maybe y'all can speak to this, is that you basically pat him on the shoulder and go, "Man, it sucks to be you," right? And you kind of go about your way after that, right? That's not what happens in female relationships, and it's not what happens between men and women. We are actually expected to do all kinds of stuff. We are expected to be the ones who arrange social stuff. We're expected to follow up on things. If somebody is hurting, we're expected to keep touch with these folks, check in on them regularly. We're expected to know things about other people's kids. There's just a whole social, it's like, and me being an introvert that I am, I fail a lot on a lot of this stuff, but the woman is supposed to be the social plug-in for the guy, right? Men, what kind of emotional labor do you guys do to each other? Are you deeply involved in each other's lives?
Hello?
Yes.
Can I speak to you?
Please do.
Okay. First of all, as a man in this room, it's pretty tense. Okay?
Oh, okay.
When I was in college, I took classes in feminism. I went to a liberal arts college. It was very tense then. Okay? This is the first time you've really addressed guys. First of all, can a man be a feminist? Because
sure.
Okay, because in all of your talking, you didn't mention that. Okay?
Yeah, men
Okay.
can be feminists.
Okay, great.
Men can be humanists. Men can be anti-racist, for sure.
Okay. Now, you've made some assumptions about men, and you said you don't know. Okay. I'm a very emotional guy. I talk to people. I talk to men. I talk to women, and so some men get it. Okay, we get it. Yes, we really do. But sometimes when you get excited, you bring a lot of energy into the situation, and it just makes it very difficult for men to feel like they can speak.
I think that's a really fair criticism, but let me just remind all of us that a lot of the tension that we face because we are looking at our own selves and how we interact with people. And to kind of shift the conversation just a little bit, I should have done a better job of talking about intersectionality, because that is something that I intended to talk more closely about, except that my phone interrupted me 50,000 times to ask me if I wanted to do Android Pay. Anyway, so one of the tensions that we also experience when we look at, say, issues with men and women, we experience tensions when we look at issues of people of color and white people. And I think that I agree with you that it's an uncomfortable thing to look at, and in a sense it feels very personal. And I just want to say that There are multiple dimensions to this problem. The problem isn't that you yourself are not feminist or that you yourself hate women. That isn't even what I think is happening in most of the cases, even with guys that are not particularly feminist-minded. I think what happens is that we are dealing with a system in which all of us are arranged in a hierarchy of sorts. And women are frequently saying, you guys have made it to the top and have left no room or very little room for us. And we're asking you to think about what your lives are like compared to ours. And for men and women, and it's, we're talking about your wives, we're talking about your daughters, and we're asking to be listened to. Now, in your household, things may be very, very equity driven, and that is awesome, and that's great. But when your wife steps outside of your door, or when your daughter steps outside of your door and goes on a date with somebody, that equity is frequently gone. And so what I'm trying to do here is to have a conversation about wider problems. It isn't necessarily what's going to boil down to one person, although if every single person was one person who changed their attitude and made a difference, then it would all add up to something large and systemic, a big systemic change. So I appreciate that you mentioned that there is a tension in this discussion, and I'm sorry about that because it is a difficult conversation to have. So let me just give you another chance to address or to have some more feedback, because I think it's important that the men in this room be able to have a voice and be heard.
And my guess is that the other men in this room still are not comfortable saying anything to you.
Well, I so appreciate that, I do. But let me just tell you how uncomfortable it is when I go on a date and the guy asks me when we're going home together. Let me just tell you.
I understand that. So we understand a lot more than perhaps you think.
Well,
or perhaps that seems to be expressed.
And I agree. I agree that.
I don't even feel comfortable talking to you right now. We need to relax. Can we just relax?
Okay, men, hear me out. When you ask a woman to relax about something that impacts my daily life, what you're essentially doing is asking me to be quiet. And I'm not going to be quiet about this. That's not okay. I'm not going to be quiet about the crappy treatment I receive from all kinds of men, not you, sir, obviously. I don't know you. So this isn't personal. It's not meant to be personal. It's meant to ask you to please think about your role. And if your role is already one of equity, then this discussion is not about you. It's about other people. Okay.
I think when we ask ourselves to examine our own bias, we find things within ourselves that maybe we aren't proud of, and that is very uncomfortable. I know I do it within myself, and I find these things that I maybe didn't expect. But what I wanted to speak to was I think a lot of us are moving around in a world where if I can do this the right way. We're moving around in this world and we're having these experiences with other people, and sometimes we don't understand, like Al said, what's packed into what's happening. So for example, I work at a dance studio with a lot of women, and we have this one male boss sort of guy, and he always whenever we have meetings, he always says things like, I work with a lot of women, there's a lot of emotions in this room.
Oh, right, yeah.
And on one hand, he'll almost say it sometimes like it's a compliment. You guys are so tender and emotional. But there's so much packed into that. I don't think he thinks I oppress women. I think he might say, these are some great qualities women have. But guess what? That's false. We're not all emotional all of the time. We're not, you know what I mean? That in and of itself is a form of oppression. And from his perspective, it's a compliment.
See, and that's why I said in the discussion that a lot of times well-meaning behavior towards us that's meant to be kind, it's meant to be caring, ends up actually being oppressive, because the fact of the matter is that I myself am not particularly emotional, depending on the environment that I'm in. Like in my work environment, I'm like, I turn on my science brain, and for somebody to come into my classroom and say, gosh, you're a woman teaching science, how emotional. You know what I'm saying? I would just be like, what are you talking about? Okay, yes.
Well, I was a senior executive for a while, and I had lots of men and women working for me. And the biggest problem I usually had was if I promoted a woman into a senior sales position because she was really good. And really good salesmen are very task-oriented, and they are not real people-oriented with the staff. And when a senior sales woman would try and interact with my secretaries, there was big problems.
Yeah.
I heard secretaries saying things like, I'm not going to take that from that bitch. And she would have taken it if the guy was a male salesman. I think women-to-women problems are a lot of the situation,
Well,
too.
and I don't disagree with that at all. And I think part of that has to do with the idea of emotional labor that we brought up a minute ago. Because when I interact with other women in a work environment, I am expected to do emotional labor even there. I'm expected to come in and say, oh my gosh, how was your weekend? How are your kids doing? And to sit there and chat about it. And the fact of the matter is that if I'm in a hurry and I've got to get this and this and this done by 11 o'clock, or I've got to zip out the door and take care of thus and such, I failed in my emotional labor. That is not expected of men. Yeah, okay, next question. Thank you.
I wanted to address what you were saying back there. I understand the tension that you feel, because a lot of the times when you're first hearing a lot of this stuff, it feels like you're being attacked specifically. It feels like, we're getting a lot of blame put on the guy, like it's all our fault and we need to change to fix it. And none of us individually have ever actually, maybe, but haven't ever actually actively done something to put women down or make them feel uncomfortable or anything like that. Like, we're not the guys out there, grabbing everybody's butts. So we're like, we're cool, we
Right.
feel like we're cool. But the women aren't blaming us. They're not saying it's our fault. It's just they want to be heard. They want us to see from their point of view what's going on. Like I have at my work, I have multiple coworkers that are the same position as I am. I have an office, and the other guy has an office, and all the other females, they have cubicles. And that's just kind of how it started off. And we have the same pay, same position, everything, but somehow I get an office because they don't, and they didn't for some reason, obvious reasons, but it's not like they intentionally thought, well, I'm going to give the guy the office. It's just, that's kind of the way it seemed like it should happen, because he deserves an office because he's been working or something like that. So it's not really about being attacked. It's not that it's our fault. It's that they just want to be heard and, want us to maybe look around a little bit, and see what's going on. It's not really about it being attacked.
Thank you.
I think you made an interesting point over there, is that a lot of the times, at least what I've faced, is that other women seem to be a large part of the problem, because I'm a stay-at-home mom, and a lot of the condescension that I've ever faced has been from other women.
Yeah.
So you say, what do you do? And I say, well, I'm a stay-at-home mom. And you get the, oh.
Oh, yeah.
Like I don't do anything. And a lot of times that comes from the female side.
So that's what I kind of mentioned a minute ago about, like, can a feminist wear a hijab? Can a feminist be a stay-at-home mom? Yes, you can. It's your choice. You know what I'm saying? And so, I think feminism, the broadest conception of feminism, includes women making choices that are right for them. So, yeah, if you want to be a stay-at-home mom, that is what you're doing, and that is your choice, and there's nothing absolutely wrong with that whatsoever. And I hate that we even have to stand here and say that there's nothing wrong with it, because it should just be obvious that there's nothing wrong with that. I am an adjunct, right, which means I work part-time, which means that I also am a part-time stay-at-home mom, and I love that. I love having that opportunity. So, the fact that I don't work 15 hours a day, because here's the perverse choice that happens to you when you're a woman, when you have to work 15 hours a day. Do you know how many people will say, oh, well, she's the vice president of operations at such and such, but you know what? She doesn't, she's away from her kids 15 hours a day. What kind of mom does that? right? Nobody ever says that about men. Nobody ever says, what kind of dad is the vice president of operations and spends 15 hours a day away from his kids? What a jerk. Nobody says that. So, yeah, I appreciate the comment. Thank you. Hey.
Hey, I have a question for you. What can moms do that are raising boys? And I think that's where we can make an impact, but I myself am having a hard time raising
Right.
feminist boys or
Right.
trying to, they feel personally attacked by feminism. And I don't know.
So that's part of the question, right? I'm a mother of a son. That's my only child, my son. And what's going to happen 15 years from now when he comes home and says to me, I got all these buddies that think feminism is stupid, right? Like, that's the battle that we're going to have to fight. I think that there's a number of things that we can do. We can try to have a home that encourages equity, which obviously I think yours does, mine does. And we can try to talk to them about what it is their buddies say to them. We can talk to them about the dates they go on with women, how they treat women, and what's expected. Because even hookup culture, I find, and let me just be clear about this with hookup culture, I don't think there's anything wrong with two folks hooking up. If that is your bag, man, go for it, do it. But what frequently happens is that hookup culture disadvantages women because those of us who are not real hookup types, who actually want a relationship, we're frequently labeled as needy and dependent and, overly emotional. And then when we get mad when we're treated like shit after the guy disposes of us, well, now we're psycho because we're angry, right? Because we were treated in a dehumanizing fashion, right? So I think that all of that kind of stuff, just continuing to put out our perspectives on what it's like to be on the receiving end of that, maybe that can help. But you're right, there is a period of time when teenagers don't listen to us regardless of what gender they are, right?
And it's true that men are unemotional about sex.
Right. Exactly. And so one thing I think we could point out, and one of the things that hopefully will dissolve some of the tension in the room, is that patriarchy is actually bad for everyone. Right? I mean, guys, nobody wants to be called a wimp or a P word because you are emotional. That's not cool. Yes. Oh, yeah. Hi.
Sorry,
Hi.
I was going to speak to that and to some of the comments earlier.
Sure.
And then I had a question as well.
Sure.
One of my parents' biggest complaints about me always has been how unemotional, how very stoic, and they say I think too much, but that's why I'm an atheist now and I'm not Mormon, I guess. But anyway, recently we had this experience. You'll see my twin 8-year-old boys, and one of them complained about something my father had done, and we brought that up to my dad and said, hey, this hurt Aaron's feelings. And my dad said, well, why? He's complained my whole life that I have no feelings, that I'm an unfeeling person. And then he complained when we said, you hurt your 8-year-old grandson's feelings.
Deeply, yeah.
He was like,
When did he get so
he wouldn't talk to us for 2 months. Yeah, when did he get so freaking sensitive?
When did he get so
I don't know.
freaking sensitive?
He's an 8-year-old human being. And so that's the thing, there's a lot of, so what really helped, and what I think helps our boys a lot is, and I've learned this from Beth a lot, just being an advocate for their feelings. We told him it was okay that his feelings were hurt, that he could have those feelings, that it wasn't anything he did, it wasn't his problem. Because there is a lot of pressure, I've felt it my whole life, for men to be a certain way and to expect women to be a certain way.
That is true. And let me just real quickly, before you ask your question, Brené Brown, y'all. Brené Brown. I love her. Brené Brown actually has a talk about vulnerability. And one of the things she said is that a guy came up to her after one of her talks and said, my wife and daughter would rather see me hoisted on a petard than to see me cry, because it would frighten them. And I think that is somewhat true. I think that maybe not the folks in this room, because it looks like a bunch of us humanists are pretty sensitive folks, but there is a number of women who are afraid. And I can tell you as a Southern woman, I am taught to be afraid of emotional men. Why? Because an emotional man cannot protect you from a violent man. That's why. Right? So there's a double standard there for sure.
Yeah,
sure.
And also just to that point, there was an interesting thread that ran on Twitter the other day about a woman she does face painting at kids' birthday parties, about a little boy who wanted a butterfly, and his mom, of all people, freaked out about a butterfly on a 4-year-old.
Oh my gosh.
So Anyway, my question is kind of referring to my parents again. You know, my dad's had a career now for 30 years. My mom has not. She's uneducated, and that's part of the systemic part of it is my mother will never be equal in a career place to my dad because she's 30 years behind. She can't catch up. Generationally, does the data show things are better? You know, my mom's in her 50s. Are 30-year-olds getting closer to equality than the 50-year-olds and the 20-year-olds getting better than the 30-year-olds? Is there generational progression?
I would say
that way?
yes. I would say there's generational progress. And the studies that I would cite would be the number of women that are going to college now. So we have a lot more women in college now. And in fact, I believe at the undergraduate levels, we actually have women outnumbering men. But of course, and here's where sexism comes in again. Well, at graduate levels, though, the trend starts to reverse. And by the time we reach doctorates, men outnumber women, and especially in the sciences and other sorts of like hard fields, so to speak. Yes, hi.
Hello. Well, we kind of have talked about this a little bit, but the thing that I wanted to bring up was how men are evolving as we women are evolving.
Sure.
So, like, you know, as a strong woman, when I go out on a date, I feel like sometimes that I don't know where that man's coming from or what his emotional background is or like that. And so I never know how to interact. And I think that sometimes men don't know how to interact with stronger women too. And so I look at someone like a quintessential example of this paradox would be someone like Bill Clinton, who was, you know, a philandering person as a husband, yet supported his wife through her career and, you know, candidacy for president and like that. So there's like a real paradox going on, and I think that, I don't know, I just would like to hear comments about this. I think that people like Farheen and yourself raising strong men, this is a good start.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, dating is an awkward thing for lots of people. But I do think that dating is a place where I've been introduced to some of the harshest sexism I've ever experienced. Like guys at work don't come up to me and go, well, I mean, it actually has happened at work that something like that happened. But generally, guys at work don't come up to me and go, gosh, you're really pretty. You want to come home with me tonight? Like, that doesn't happen. That happens on dates. You know, and on dates or in my intimate relationships, men have ideas about how to be the man in the relationship. And if I'm strong, you know, if I'm a feminist, it somehow diminishes his masculinity. And so I myself have questions about, like, how on earth do I navigate this? You know, men, do you have thoughts on this? Like, how do we women navigate this idea that your masculinity is somehow diminished by us, you know, demanding dignity?
Last question.
Okay.
Well, actually, this is a little bit more of a comment for the men that are concerned. There's actually a friend of mine has a website called thesensitiveman.com, and he'll probably has some interesting information for you. So.
Okay, cool. Sensitiveman.com. Thank you. I know it's not an easy conversation to have, but hopefully, you know, I want to recognize that I think all of the men in this room are sensitive, caring folks, or else you wouldn't be here to begin with. So thank you for hearing us out today, and I'm sorry if there was tension that made you uncomfortable. But it looks like we have the future generation of skeptical thinkers entering the room now, including my own little kiddo.